Page 232 of The Unfolding is the story of Justin and Trisha Davis.
He said, if you really love Justin, you'll let him go. And I said, if I let him go, he's going to choose her. And he said, he already has. I went upstairs and I packed his things up. It was worse than death because he was alive. He just didn't want to be with me.
God's story has been unfolding.
Since the beginning of time.
He invites you to be a part of it.
Wow. Another page in The Unfolding.
Hi, this is Meredith Foster. Justin and Trisha Davis appeared to be living the dream. Beautiful family, successful ministry, a future filled with promise. After planting their first church, Justin had an affair with a staff member who was also Trisha's best friend. Their marriage, family, and careers were simultaneously blown apart, and they were forced to come to terms with their brokenness. It seemed like their story would be one of failure and loss, but Justin and Trisha found grace, love, and redemption for even the most shattered parts of their lives. Just a word of caution, this episode includes mature content. It may not be appropriate for younger listeners.
I grew up in Joliet, Illinois. My dad is Hispanic. My mom is white, Irish, probably a little bit of everything. So I grew up in an inner city setting where I went to school. Just so many gifts I didn't realize I was given as a kid until I was an adult, but just very multicultural, multi-ethnic. And it's just kind of all I knew. But my family grew up lower income. So my dad didn't make it past the 8th grade. And then my mom, she got pregnant her senior year of high school. And she did graduate from high school, but it was just a lot of hard stories that I grew up with. My mom lost her dad when she was in 8th grade. And then her mom died 2 years later of breast cancer. So just kind of culturally how I grew up was I did not realize how authentic I felt like I lived because our stuff was so out there. It was like things you couldn't hide. And so I felt like our family was very honest, very open. But my parents didn't grow up in a Christian culture. And so through an invitation of my mom's sister, we ended up going to this little Baptist church in the middle of downtown Joliet. It was literally right across the street from my high school. And I remember it changing the climate of my family. Everybody just seemed, happy is not the right word. I would say everybody felt loved. Like we had found community and community that probably my mom hadn't experienced in that way. My dad is one of, I think, 7 siblings. So, he came from a big family, but this was a different kind of family. And so all the way up until I graduated from high school, I fell in love with God. And I tell people this sounds so silly, but I really believed him. And it's probably because I'm a middle child rule follower. So faith probably comes easier to me. And I was your typical teenager. I would get in trouble and I would not always make wise decisions. But at the end of the day, I knew Jesus truly loved me and it allowed me to just love others.
Justin, what was your growing up like?
It's interesting how similar and yet how vastly different Trish and I experienced childhood, because I grew up in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and I spent the first 7 or 8 years of my life in the country. We lived on a farm. We never had a lot of money. My parents got married 15 days after I was born. My mom got pregnant in high school as well. So she was super smart and had a bunch of scholarships, but then when she got pregnant, it derailed any college opportunity for her. And so my parents got married. We're not people of faith. My dad was a mechanic, worked with his hands a lot, but we were often on food stamps. I can remember standing in line for cheese and bread with my mom when I was a kid. We were just that poor. We got evicted from several rental homes. We lived in a trailer park for part of my childhood. Started going to church when I was like an infant or a toddler, sometime when I was really, really young. My mom accepted Christ first, and then my dad came to faith. And obviously I was too young to know the difference before Christ or after Christ. But I remember growing up, we went to church all the time. Like every time the doors were open, we were there. Looking back now as a 51-year-old, my desire to go into ministry, I think, was birthed out of the local church coming around my family in times of need. My dad worked 7 days a week, but my parents had a very volatile marriage. They didn't fight all the time, just when they were together. And so I grew up really not really seeing a difference between my parents' behavior. It changed on Sundays when we were at church, and my dad would say, "Get it together, we got to go into church." And so there was this disconnect between what took place on Sunday and who my parents were at home. Conflict was something that I wanted to avoid at all costs. I hated conflict. My dad got arrested several times for domestic violence. He and my mom would get into like knockdown, drag out fights, literally. And the police would come. My dad would leave for a day. He would leave for 3 days. Sometimes he'd be gone a week or two. Just carrying that sense of fear of conflict, that was kind of a theme all throughout. I did not want to make anyone angry. I did not want to make anybody disappointed. We kind of walked on eggshells, hoping not to set my dad off. But over the course of time, as we started going to church, my parents' income, it got better over time. But I remember one Sunday coming home from church and my dad had lost his job. We had this huge porch and there were literally just bags and bags of groceries all over the porch where my parents' Sunday school class had bought us groceries. And so there were like moments like that where I could just really see God's hand of provision and the power of Christian community. Even though my parents were deeply flawed, they tried to love God and they tried to raise us to love God. And so by the time Trish and I met, we couldn't have been any more different. But as we started talking about our life experience, we had so much in common that gave us, it was almost like a running start into a relationship and a friendship, because we spoke each other's language and we understood hard work. We each had jobs since we were 14. Like there were certain aspects about us that were so similar, even though our upbringings were so different.
You met at college. Was it friendship at first sight or was it love at first sight?
It was love at first sight for me. It was detestment at first sight for her.
For Justin, it was on both sides. So like he loved himself a lot and loved me. So it's funny because I probably would call him JD till this day, that all the girls called him JD. And being like hardcore Trisha, 1993 me, I was like, "What's up, Justin?" So. But
we were at this little Bible college in Central Illinois, and, I played basketball and I thought I was way more important than what I really was. But I knew I was more important than Trisha thought I was. So I just wish she would have actually given me the time of day.
I did have a boyfriend back home, so I turned down Justin many times. But him being like the man on campus, he made a bet that he could get me to go out with him. And Justin always jokes about like, where do Christians learn to gossip? At Christian college. And so, of course, I found out. And he got busted. But I went home for Christmas break. I did break up with my boyfriend. And then when I came back, Justin played basketball. I was a cheerleader. And we were such a small, poor school that like all the games were like you went on the same bus together. And I remember distinctly when our relationship, our friendship completely pivoted when Justin's family was going through a really tough time. And he shared it with me in a way that he had not been vulnerable with anybody before. And that was all I knew. So I wasn't like shocked, or it was like, okay, well, tell me more about this. And so we became friends out of like safety that turned into a relationship that now, we'll celebrate 30 years of marriage in July.
What moved you to be vulnerable in that way, Justin? Was that really unusual for you?
It was, image and appearance were really big for me, pretending to have it more together than what I really did. That was really how I lived my life. I don't know. I think Trisha has a very compassionate quality about her. She's very empathetic, even for people she doesn't know. And that empathy, I think, made me feel safe. And so I just felt comfortable sharing with her what I was going through, what my family and parents were going through back home. I had nobody else to talk to about it, but Trisha really knew me for who I was. And so we had several of those conversations that obviously there was a relational connection, but then there became relational intimacy as a result of just, being vulnerable and authentic with one another.
Was that different than any dating relationship you'd had before?
Oh, absolutely. There was a depth of Trisha's character and just her emotional IQ that I had never really experienced in a friendship or in a dating relationship. And so I just wanted to be around her. I wasn't a breakfast person at all, but she got up every morning and ate breakfast. And so I started getting up earlier and coincidentally running to her in the cafeteria. And I would routinely skip chapel and have someone else sign in for me. So I hope that doesn't nullify my degree now that I didn't always go to chapel, but I wanted to be next to Trish. So I'd go and sit next to her at chapel, and she led worship. And so I would go to the worship nights that she was leading worship at. And so there was this gravitational pull toward authenticity, being in a relationship with her, but also she was inadvertently, I think, pulling me closer to God.
I was going to ask about that. What was happening? Because I'm sure you had your relationship with God, whatever that was like at home. Now you're getting to college and circumstances are different, and you're also having these opportunities to grow. Did your relationship with God change during that season?
I think it did, to the level that I was capable of experiencing. There was a ton of brokenness in my life personally, and a ton of hiddenness that I was not willing to share or tell the truth about, even to myself as an 18 or 19-year-old kid. That would come out years later. But I think to the level that I was capable, my relationship with God was growing at a rate that I didn't know possible. And I felt at that time called to ministry. And so I started serving a little church in Newmarket, Indiana on the weekends. They paid me $100 to teach Sunday school and lead youth group. So I started falling in love with Trish. I started falling in love with the local church. And I started really having a vision for my life that I'm going to get out of Crawfordsville. Like I'm going to not struggle, borrowing money from my parents like my parents borrowed from their parents. I'm not going to get evicted from a house like my parents got evicted. So I felt like, okay, here's my path forward. We're going to get married. We're going to have an amazing ministry and an amazing family because we're choosing to do things differently than our parents did.
So, Trisha, he'd been doing the full court press on you, sitting next to you, sitting there at chapel, coming to worship nights. What point did the relationship change in your mind?
Immediately.
The confidence.
This is going to sound really horrible, and I don't want it to come off judgmental for people who share my story, but it's interesting as I look back. The way that I looked at life and my relationship with God, it was like I had to parse out in adulthood, like what was just how I'm wired as a real follower and what did I really believe as who Jesus said he was. Where a lot of people have church baggage, I didn't have that. So like my happy memories of my family were at church. Being at this Christian college, Meredith, I'm telling you, like when I think about it, I don't know how I survived. One, we didn't have the money. So like a lady from church, her name was Lolly. She was amazing. She was single. She's a teacher. And I always tell people who are single, like, do not discount your life. This woman changed my life. It has nothing to do with your relationship status. Like, go change the world and be who God called you to be. And that was Lolly. So she took me to get bedding. And then my parents just dropped me off. Like, we didn't know that they would move us in. And all of these people like spoke church language. And I remember, I don't even think I took the SAT. I had to take it and I did really bad on it, but somehow I still got in. The first test was the book of the Bible. And I'm like, how do you say it? Like, how do you spell it? Like, so I'd grown up in church, but I didn't grow up so much in church culture that when I got to Lincoln, I knew what I was doing. I was such a fish out of water, to the point that I went to my room, having a roommate. I grew up, I was either in a room with my brother when I was little or my sister when I was older. So it was the first time ever in my life I had my own dresser. And I thought that was amazing. But there were some gals hanging out next door and I pop over there again, kind of this innocent, I don't know what you would call it. I still haven't been able to get a name, but I thought they were all introducing themselves. So I introduced myself and they look at me like I have a third eye. Well, they had all gone to Christian camp together. They knew who they were. And I just kind of bebop in like, hey, I'm Trisha Lopez. And they have been my best friends ever since. Like, we're still very connected. But it was a lot of those, like, I had no idea what I was doing. It ended up being the biggest gift because I didn't know to be insecure because I didn't know what I was doing. I just didn't.
It's truly a gift. No joke. That is a gift. So many of us know just enough to know that we are falling way short and then that mars our ability to build relationships and be authentic and all of those things. What a gift you were to that campus. I'll just say it now.
Well, so then meeting Justin, kind of my caveat when I started to answer your question was he was the first guy, like even the guy I dated in high school, we went to youth group, but we were sexually active. We did things that I knew wasn't what God was calling us to be. And then I met Justin and he respected my boundaries. And it was like, even though he had brokenness, I authentically believe the younger version of us felt like if we just loved Jesus and honored him in our relationship, then he would heal all of the wounds and the mistakes we made in our past. And we believed that for the first 10 years of our marriage. Like if we're serving Jesus, and that's what we did, Justin graduated. And then 4 months into marriage, I found out that I didn't have the flu. I was pregnant. And so Justin was still a senior in college. So like we get married. Now we're parents. A couple months later, he graduates. So life just came at us really fast. And everywhere we went, we had ministry success. Our youth groups grew and we loved it. Like we authentically loved ministry. And so the formula, the theology of love God and love each other with, in our minds, you'll live this up into the right life. Well, in the first 10 years, that's what was happening. And so we planted our first church in 2002, just with our little family. And we planted in all the ways that church planters now would be like, no, don't do that. But like we didn't know what we were doing, loved God, and he'll bless it. So we moved to Noblesville, Indiana, which at the time was the fastest growing county, I think, in the United States. And we launched a church. And 3 years later, we had over 700 people coming, people being baptized. And it was just literally the sweetest experience. And in those days, when you try to plant a church, statistically, 80% of them failed. So the fact that we were thriving and we had raised $1 million year 3 to buy the building we were in, everything was going up until the right until it wasn't.
In that season, the first 10 years of our marriage, Trish and I were so compatible. Like I would speak, she would lead worship. I would speak, she would lead a small group. I would, cast vision. She would execute the vision. Like there was this partnership. Looking back on it now, it was a codependency that we had created in our marriage that, you couldn't tell where our marriage started and ministry stopped. It was basically the same. We didn't realize that was unhealthy. That was just, we grew up together. We were all that each other had. We moved to Sandusky, Ohio. We were the youngest people in the church, and Micah was the only baby in the nursery under 6th grade. We were all that we had. And what we thought was partnership and teamwork was this codependent relationship that began to define our marriage. And it equaled ministry success, but it took a toll on our relationship that we didn't necessarily even realize it was taking because we didn't know anything different.
Things usually start to show some signs that they're unraveling. In hindsight, do you look back and say, that was a point that we just kind of blew past or whatever?
I think for me, it was my parents' divorce. Justin and I had been married for 2 years. We had this 1-year-old baby. And again, I'm operating out of, if you know Jesus and fall in love with them, then healing comes and everything is successful. And then all of a sudden, that wasn't the story of my parents. And I recognized years later, not at that moment when my parents divorced, but I had such rose-colored glasses of my parents that were unfair to them and unspoken expectations of God that I thought he healed everything. And I thought that my parents were amazing people, but there was so much I just didn't know. And so this was the point in my life where not knowing did not serve me well. I was just inept to understand the reality of family dynamics and what happened, Meredith, in that I didn't recognize and didn't know until I had to recognize it, is I began to stiff arm Justin emotionally, physically, and somewhat spiritually. Because if my dad can't be trusted, I don't know if you can. And so I operated in the first 10 years skeptical. But I knew that the first mistress would be the church, and Justin loved the church too much to give her up, to mess up our marriage by struggling with pornography or struggling with infidelity. I knew that that would never be our story because I knew he loved the church more.
Justin, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, going back to my childhood and just my inability to navigate conflict in a healthy way and learning or believing that if we were arguing, I was failing. And so I oriented our whole marriage around not the presence of intimacy, but the absence of conflict. And so if we weren't arguing, we were good. And if we did argue, hey, you got to get over that because you're leading worship tomorrow. Hey, let's resolve this because I got to speak in the morning. I mean, sometimes the motivation was to reconcile and to grow. I'm not going to say 100 times out of 100 it wasn't that. But I would say predominantly, I didn't want to grow through conflict. I wanted it to go away. So there was that dynamic of our relationship where I began to withhold things from Trish that I thought would make her mad or thought would upset her or I thought would hurt her. And so anytime you compromise truth in a relationship, you limit the amount of intimacy that relationship is capable of experiencing.
Whoa, say that again.
So the word intimacy, we equate it with sex, but the word intimacy means to be fully known. Right. And so all of us have this desire to be fully known, but we also have a greater fear of not being loved. And so we compromise truth in our relationships, not because we want to be liars, but because we want to be loved. And we think the people that we love won't love us in return if they know the truth about us. And so that was really, it wasn't that I was trying to hurt my marriage. I thought I was protecting it by withholding the parts of my heart or the parts of my struggle or story that I thought would upset Trish or disrupt our relationship. And we can only be loved to the extent that we're known. And so by doing that, I limited the amount of intimacy we were capable of experiencing. And I think the same is true in our relationship with God. We think that if God ever knew that about me, he wouldn't love me. And so that's why a lot of people, including me, compartmentalize their life, and they have God in one portion of it, and then they struggle with other things and, Monday through Saturday. And that really began to catch up to us 10 years into marriage. We, planted the church in 2002. We celebrated 10 years of marriage in 2005. We come back from a cruise that we went on for our 10-year anniversary, knowing that our marriage was not in good shape, thinking that we just were tired. We just need a break. We just need to get out of town. And my capability to compartmentalize my life, it reached its limit. Some of the struggles and some of the brokenness and some of the wounds that I had accumulated that I had not addressed, some of the brokenness and wounds that we had accumulated in our marriage relationship began to push back on my ability to manage it. And sin management was kind of how I operated my life. If I could manage it and keep it at bay, then I was doing well. And all this culminated on October 9th, 2005, when I came home from church and told Trish that I didn't want to be married anymore, that I was not in love with her anymore. I was having an affair with her best friend and I wanted to be with her. And Meredith, it wasn't a confession of remorse or repentance. It was just a confession of resignation. And I think when you give to a relationship and you give and you give and you give, and what you think you deserve in return isn't reciprocated, a sense of entitlement begins to live in your heart. And that person can never repay you all that you think they owe. And that's kind of where I was in my relationship with Trish. She wasn't going to be the wife I felt like I wanted. And so I was done. So obviously that conversation got very intense very quickly. And Trish left the house just completely destroyed. And a few minutes later, the chairman of our elders called. And, here we had this 3-year-old church. Our average age was 28. As Trish said, we just raised $1 million to buy this building. And I had cheated on all of them too. And they came over to my house and tried to talk me out of the consequences of my choices, because I wasn't going to be the pastor of the church anymore, but the choice itself to leave my wife. And we had 3 boys at the time who were 9, 6, and 3. And I was just in such a dark place that I couldn't hear it. And so Trish didn't want me at the house anymore. So I went and checked into a hotel. And as I arrived at the hotel, a lady from our church called and she said, if you have any hope of restoring your marriage, you're going to go to this counseling appointment that we've made for you tomorrow. And I just thought, counseling? I don't go to counseling. I'm a pastor. But by God's grace, I show up at this counselor's office the next day and sit down kind of defiantly in her office and share just a portion of the story with her. And she said, can I just ask you, why are you even here? What do you hope to accomplish with this counseling session? And I said, if I'm just being straight up honest with you, here's what I want you to help me figure out. I need you to help me figure out how God's going to bless my life, no matter who I choose. That's what I want. And she said something in that moment that became the linchpin for the restoration that God would do in our marriage. She said, I can help broken people. I can't help hard-hearted people. And I'd been, Christian since I was 10 years old. I'd been a pastor for 10 years, and I never really experienced brokenness. And because I wasn't repentant, Trisha was advised to kick me out of the house. And so she packed up everything that I owned, and I moved in with a family that had helped us start the church. And we didn't talk for the next 10 days. We were separated for 2.5 months. And God used that experience. Those first 10 days, we had a mediator that helped us get our kids back and forth because she didn't want to have any contact with me. And God began to break my heart for my marriage again. And I didn't know if I was going to get a second chance. And so I started going to counseling by myself.
Trisha, can you talk about the events leading up to that October 9th day? Did you have any idea that things were in the shape that they were?
It's like I did and then I didn't. I knew that there were parts of my heart that bitterness had gone full-blown resentment. And I was resentful towards Justin. I was resentful for another ministry that I had given everything to on top of being a mom and never got paid for any of it. Not that mattered, but it was just like there wasn't a reward of like, I see you or you're doing a good job. And so I wish I could remember like the moment, but I just knew Justin didn't like me. So it wasn't that he didn't love me. He didn't like me. He didn't want to be around me. We had gone to a leadership conference and he didn't want to sit with me. It was just, he was very icy with me and I couldn't figure out really why. And I remember going back after that conference and being at church and going to a couple to say, I don't think Justin and I are healthy. He just kind of like put his hand on my shoulder and just basically told me he thought I was making it bigger than it was. And so when I was shut down, then it was just like, well, there's nothing else that I can do. And so that's why, the 10-year anniversary cruise was, we just needed a break. We needed a restart. We needed, a lot of us think like what we were really doing was like behavior modification. Let's go on a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean where we don't have to do real life. And we had so much fun. But then when we stepped off the cruise ship, we stepped right back into the dysfunctional life. And then, several weeks later, everything blows up. But I remember that weekend particularly, it went from he didn't like me to I think he hates me. I went to a high-end store, which I've never done in my whole life, and spent money that we didn't have. And I bought an amazing outfit. I got up really early. I was leading worship, so I had to be there earlier anyway. But like when I walked in the building, people were like, oh my gosh, you look stunning. And that was the goal. I wanted to look my best so that Justin would want to be around me, but I didn't know why. Then right before I was getting ready to walk onto, the stage to lead worship, I found Justin and my best friend having a very close conversation. And it was like, I knew. And so we do what all of us do. We kind of go to the vice that makes us feel like we're centered. When I got home, I just went to bed. I took a nap and my kids were little. So that wasn't odd, but it was like, I didn't know what was coming. And so when Justin woke me up and said, I don't want to be married anymore, it was like, I was so exhausted already up until that point and I didn't know why. And then he confirmed why. And his confession, like it changed everything. A lot of people, if they're in a different industry, their spouse having an affair will affect their marriage, maybe their income, but I lost everything. My kids and I were not allowed to come back to the church. We never went back. I wasn't allowed to say goodbye. And I had a mentor of mine who fought tooth and nail for them to at least read a letter from me to be able to say goodbye to my church. It was just handled in a very broken way. And I don't fault them. They were put in a place of that predicament, but it was like just soul crushing. And then my best friend. And now that I'm almost 50, you look back on those relationships and they're just seasonal relationships you can never get back. And that was the relationship that we threw our baby showers for each other. And we're at the hospital with each other when babies were born. It was like so much history lost. And I had never hit rock bottom in all that my parents had been through and my mom had suffered. Like I knew suffering. But it was like my theology was blown to smithereens of like, wait, hold up. What? I did everything that you asked me, and this is what happened.
Trisha's theology was busted and she was crushed. Justin had finally come face to face with his brokenness. Their whole world had been blown apart. Putting it back together seemed impossible.
I remember sitting on my couch. My kids, who were young, were all sitting at my feet. And I think I was like really crying. And I grabbed my Bible that Justin had just gotten me for my 30th birthday. And I just told God, I'm like, you get a moment here to show up. I'm going to crack this open and this is it, or I am so out. And I opened it. I love the book of Hebrews, which I know sounds weird because it's not the most fun book. But what I love about the book of Hebrews is how it takes Old Testament principles and it makes them make sense in the new covenant. And it gives everything purpose. And so when I opened it up, that wasn't surprising. But then what I read made me fiery mad, because the scripture said that our earthly fathers did the best that they knew how, but God's discipline is always good and right for us. And I was like, wrong chapter, wrong verse, because I don't need to be disciplined. But then when I turned the page, verse 11 started and it says, no discipline is enjoyable while it's happening. It's painful. And it was like God was saying, I see you. And then it goes on to say, but afterwards, there will be a harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. So take a new grip with your tired hands and stand firm on your shaky legs. And those who follow you, though they are weak and lame, and my children are literally at my feet, they will not fall and stumble, but they will become strong. And I realized in that moment, I had hit rock bottom. But that rock bottom is solid surface to stand. And what I had recognized for the first time in my life, I had sifted my life, my being, my existence through the sifter of ministry. And I was as good to God as I was successful in ministry, as I was successful in my relationship with Justin, as a mom, as a friend, all of these areas, and all of it was taken away. I lost everything. And then God said, but you still matter to me. You are just as important to me before this. In the losing of everything, I feel like I gained the one thing that I was always supposed to be living for, and that my worth and my value has never been tied to a relationship status or what I do for God, but simply who I am in Him. And I am a child of God.
When you had that really valuable revelation about who you are to God, did you have any hope about marriage restoration? Did you even have a clarity of thought about that?
No, not at all. And in fact, my mom shoved the phone in my face and said, there's a counselor on the phone that wants to talk to you. And I think she called Focus on the Family, and they have free counseling. So I get on and, I tell this guy, this was within 24 hours of everything coming out. And I just told him, I want Justin to come back home. What do I need to do for him to come back home? And he said, well, if you really love him, you'll let him go. Now, if you ever want to wonder if I'm from Southside Chicago, this would be the moment that would reveal it, because I did not handle it well. And I said, you are the dumbest, except I used different words, counselor I have ever talked to. I'm like, that is the dumbest advice you could possibly give me. I was a little spicy, but what I was so grateful for him is that what he did is he held space for the truth that I was feeling. And that's what needed to be spoken. I needed to stop vetting myself through what I think God wanted me to be. And I needed to be authentically how I felt in the pain. And he said, if you really love Justin, you'll let him go. And I said, if I let him go, he's going to choose her. And he said, he already has. Until you let go of trying to control your husband, control your outcomes, and control what you think God thinks of you, nothing will change. And you will be his scapegoat for the rest of your life. And that's when I went upstairs and I packed his things up. And I tell people out of our whole story, that moment was worse than even finding out, because I just sobbed packing up his stuff. And it was worse than death because he was alive. He just didn't want to be with me. And so all of that striving that I had done 24 hours beforehand to try and get him not just to stay married to me, just to like me, And now, not only did he not like me, he didn't want to be with me. And it was gutting. But what would unfold in the days to come would be the hardest season, I think, of our life. At the same time, we would experience what Jesus said, that the truth sets you free. And I think for many of us, the person listening to this, whether our story resonates to you, like where you are right now, or like what you grew up in, the reality is sometimes we don't know what we don't know. We don't know sometimes the words that have been spoken to us have created messages and even theology that wasn't meant to be created, but it's how we received it and it's how we've lived it out. There are aspects of our relationship that I didn't know that you couldn't be a little bitter. I just thought I could manage my bitterness. I didn't know that bitterness always leans to resentment, and resentment is like a cancer that doesn't affect just the relationship of the person you can't forgive, but it starts to affect your whole being. It starts to affect your health. I didn't know any of those things. And so while I had hit rock bottom, from that moment till almost 20 years later, what we have learned is, while the same is true that toxic behavior lives to a toxic life, healing and healthy choices leads to a full life. And that's different from the picture I had of rule following Trisha, who's like, follow Jesus and up into the right life. It decimated that and gave me what I believe is the whole picture that God had always intended, that still put Jesus on the cross. That life is messy. People are disappointing. I'm disappointing, but God truly is. He's faithful. He's able, and he will, and he can redeem anything. Maybe not always on the side of heaven, but like what he says, that little girl, 9-year-old me that believed, it was like I got lost along the way, but I got back to that same truth that God truly is who he said he was when I was the pedestal version of myself and when I was the lowly version of myself.
So Trisha packs my things up. We decide I'm going to stay with this family who helped us start the church. I had $240. I don't know why she left $40 in there. She left $240 in her bank account. And so the guy I was staying with handed me a note. And as he's handed it to me, he said, it's going to feel like it's over, but it's not over. And I didn't really know what that meant. And so I opened it up and it says $240. And I said, what's that? He goes, that's how much money you have. He said, you're going to be staying up in my daughter Katie's bedroom. So I walk up the stairs and open the door, and it's pink bedroom, bunch of veil looking stuff dangling. I didn't have daughters at the time. So pedestal bed with all of this fabric draped over the bed. He said, you're going to stay in here. And everything I owned was stacked up against the wall, boxes. And then it was that moment that I kind of fell on the floor, just realized the gravity of the choices that I had made. And he said, I know Trisha doesn't want to talk to you right now, but I think you should go to counseling. And so I started going to counseling by myself. And 10 days into our separation, Trisha called me on my cell phone. I tell people all the time, if the prodigal son's dad would have had a cell phone, this would have been a call he would have made. And she said, I hear you've been going to counseling. I said, yes. She said, well, I'm willing to go with you. And so we started going to counseling a few days later. We went 4 days a week for the next 2 months. The only reason we didn't go on Fridays is because they were closed.
It's true.
The first 30 days of counseling were amazing because we were having conversations that we never had before. And it was like the layer of hurt that was the most visible we were addressing. And then 30 days into counseling, our counselor said, you're at a really critical time in your recovery because Trisha's starting to trust you again. We had circled a day on the calendar. I was going to move back home. And he said, Justin, if you've left anything out, now's the time to share it, because unconfessed sin will always lead to repeated behavior. So if you don't want to be back here in 3 months or 3 years or 13 years, you better come clean right now. And I knew in my heart that I was leaving some things out, not because I wanted to hurt her, because I thought if she knew that, it would be over. And so I confessed more about the affair, and Trish said, it's over. I'm done. Left me at the counseling session. And so I had to find a ride back to the house. The counselor actually called me that night thinking that I was having suicidal ideation. I was just so down, and just to check on me. And I said, she's done. It's over. And so I came over to the house on Monday to pick the kids up for school. And she said, this is your last chance. I want to know everything. And so I said, as far as the affair goes, I've told you everything, but I have more to tell you. I said I was sexually abused when I was a kid, and I've never told anyone about it. I've never gotten help for it. I said I struggled with pornography for the first 10 years of our marriage, and I've lied to you about it. I've denied it. I've preached against it. And if you want to divorce me, you can have everything. This isn't about us anymore. This is about me finally living a right relationship with God. And in an act of grace and mercy, and like anything I'd ever experienced, she said, now we can start over. Now we can begin again because I finally know the real you. And I wish that was the finish line. We high-fived and lived happily ever after. That was really the starting line of what became a 2-year process of finding healing from sexual abuse and freedom from sexual addiction. And it's really a restoration process that continues to this day. And so I moved back. We renewed our vows, and I moved back home. And then we just kind of picked up and moved out of Noblesville to about 40 minutes away and kind of started our life all over. I started working as a headhunter, placing commercial bankers in banks. And we never had any dream or any vision of ever sharing our story with anyone.
No, never.
Never going back into ministry.
No, we weren't those people that said, oh, God's going to use it. We didn't care. It was just like, and I think that was so good for us.
And I think at that time, what we perceived was ministry did this to us.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What we didn't realize then that we know now is who we became in ministry did that to us.
Yeah.
We were doing a podcast a few days ago, and someone asked me, how would you describe the 10-year-old version of you? I used to think I described that version of me as really broken, but I was so wounded. You know, I just had so many wounds from my childhood and so many things that I didn't even know I was carrying into adulthood and into our marriage. It doesn't make my choices right, but it helps me have compassion for that version of myself that I did not have either the knowledge or capacity at that season of my life to even acknowledge those wounds. And so that really started the healing process after all of the truth was out, you know, and truth is the foundation of trust, but it's also the currency of intimacy. And so we weren't going to have the marriage that we desired without the truth.
I know everybody listening is relating to some part of your story and is dealing with fallout in relationships because of inauthenticity, because of not being able to tell the truth. Where do we start to get help to be truth tellers so that we can have healthy relationships?
What we have discovered, not just for our marriage story, but for the book that we're releasing, what we've learned since then, all these years later, that have applied to not just a marriage story, but to be human. What are those foundational places for us to not get stuck in cycles that hurt our relationships and hold us back from being who God called us to be? We've discussed it. That first part is telling the truth. The problem is when we say that, we cheapen it by making it a statement when telling the truth is a process. Because sometimes we've lied to ourselves for so long that we've believed that lie as true. And so I would say you can start with sharing with a friend. It's someone who's safe. I am a huge believer in counseling. We're both life coaches, and I'm passionate about coming alongside, whether it's pastoral care or life coaching. We need people to come alongside us to help us figure out, to Justin's point, sometimes these things were done to you, and we can live in the shame of those things and try to own things we were never meant to own. So some of those truths, it's almost, I don't want to say like enlightenment, but it takes time to process. We say it in a framework of like, what's mine to own, what's theirs to own, and what's ours to own. And there are some aspects that our life, we can't own them. We can't change how our parents parented us, or we can't change what happened in the church, or we can't change how a friend betrayed us or a spouse. Like, that's really real, but how did I show up in it? Being a person of truth is a lifestyle of health. And so learning how to speak that, Dr. Allison Cook, she just came out with a book called I Shouldn't Feel This Way. And she's a licensed therapist, has been so for over 20 years. And she has this very simple formula that is so impactful. It's easy to say, it's hard to do, but she says, name the wound, name it. And that was the gift that our counselor gave us, almost 20 years ago. He said, you can't heal a wound you don't give a name to. And so I would say the first thing that they could do to start moving in that direction is to be a person of truth, but to carry grace and kindness and understanding towards yourself, that it is a process. I would think the second thing that has been impactful for our story, and I think for keeping us from being stuck in unhealthy cycles in our relationship, is forgiveness. And forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood topics in the church today, because many of us believe that if we forgive, then we have to forget. If we forgive, that means we have to trust them and we have to be in relationship with them. If we forgive, if I didn't do it right, it needs to be a one-time event, because if I feel those emotions again and have to forgive again, then I'm a bad person because I didn't forgive them. But I think when Jesus talked about how to pray and he said, give us our daily bread. And then right after he says, and help us forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. I believe what Jesus was saying is that as food is to our nourishment of our bodies, forgiveness is the nourishment to our souls. It is a lifestyle of learning and at the same time recognizing what forgiveness isn't. And forgiveness isn't a get out of jail free card. Forgiveness doesn't equate trust. Forgiveness is free. Trust is earned. It's a totally different topic. But what forgiveness does is it prevents bitterness from destroying your heart. It prevents you from stiff-arming people that then you can't be fully loved and fully known because you're not allowing yourself to be accessed in a way that God has called us to be accessed. And it is a process of forgiveness.
That is very good. You said you didn't intend to tell your story and you never intended to be back in ministry. How did that happen?
So we kind of started our life all over in 2005. In 2009, a local pastor here in Indianapolis asked if we would share our story for the first time.
And I said, nope. And then he said, pray about it. And I was like, we were in ministry. Do not play the pastor card with me. I will not pray about it. But then a couple of months later, I told Justin, I told the pastor, and I told God, I will share this story one time. I'll do it one time. And then I'm out.
So we shared it. And after the service, people stayed for hours, like to the point where we had to call my mom to come get our kids because we were there till 4 or 5 in the afternoon, talking to people, praying with people.
And I kept looking at Justin going, did they not hear what we just said? We're the poster children of how not to be married. Like, did I miss it?
So that really kind of opened our heart up, and we put our name and our email address in the bulletin and said, if you need marriage help, let us know. And like 160 people reach out to us. So we went from never talking about it for 3.5 years to talking about it all the time. And it was just this emotional, we hadn't processed it to the level that we have now. And so that's when we started refineus.org and started sharing our story online. We started traveling and speaking. I was still working as a headhunter. And then the church that we left in Noblesville actually laid hands on us and commissioned us back into ministry in 2009. And we moved to Nashville, Tennessee. And I went on staff at a church called Crosspoint Church as a campus pastor. And when we were there, God really began to open up doors for us to start doing marriage conferences, start speaking more. And we wrote our first book in 2013 called Beyond Ordinary, When a Good Marriage Just Isn't Good Enough. And that book really chronicles a lot of detail of our marriage restoration story. Like Trisha, she shares several like journal entries in there from that season. And we shared 12 principles for marriage enrichment and growing in your marriage in that book. So we've continued to pour into relationships and over the last few years began to recognize that beyond just marriage, a lot of us struggle with cyclical behavior in all of our relationships. And the common denominator in all of those relationships, work, sibling, parent-child, is us. And so if we can figure out how to break cycles in our own heart, in our own relationship with God, it is going to equate to much healthier relationships, no matter what your relationship status is.
As you hear our story, you may want to fight that battle that Satan is speaking over you. Did God really say? Because your story is way more broken if people only knew, or the truths that you have hidden for so long. There's no going back from that. I just want to encourage the listener that like their heart is beating fast. They just feel like they could not be brave enough. They just don't even know where to start. I just want you to be encouraged that God has given us the gift of the Holy Spirit. In Romans 8:26 tells us that the Holy Spirit literally will go to the throne of God on your behalf with groans. There are no words. And oftentimes when we think of telling the truth, we think about being ousted. But the Holy Spirit isn't ousting you. He's inviting you to partner with him and say, you don't have to do this on your own. You may not know how it's going to turn out, but you deserve to walk in freedom no matter what you have done. And so I just want to encourage that listener. If you don't know where to start and you don't have a friend that you feel safe enough with, just cry out to Jesus. And I know that sounds so like, thanks, but in those moments of my world falling apart, and I've seen this with so many people, like he will answer if you will just allow him to partner with you.
I know from the response to past stories we have shared about reconciled marriages that there are many of you who are either in a difficult marriage or you know someone who is. I'm so glad you're listening to this episode because Justin and Trisha's story points to real hope. And Justin and Trisha have a passion to help others break off unhealthy habits and build stronger, healthier relationships. In 2012, they founded Refine Us. That's where they help broken and hurting married couples get honest with themselves, rebuild trust, and create deeply connected marriages through Christ-centered support. You can find out more about marriage coaching, the podcast they host, it's called Let's Get Real, and their books, including a brand new book called One Choice Away from Change, Break the Cycles That Hurt Your Relationships and Hold You Back. All that and more is at refineus.org. It was such a privilege to talk with Justin and Trisha, and I'm so grateful that they're willing to share their story. Hey, if you're looking for resources to help your marriage thrive, check out Behind Our Smiles. It's a podcast hosted by Joe and Tara Buchanan. They've shared their stories here on The Unfolding. Joe and Tara are passionate about promoting healthy relationships while normalizing struggle and maximizing hope. You can find Behind Our Smiles on your favorite podcast app. Thanks to all the folks that helped to make this episode of The Unfolding possible. Lindsay Caparoon, Michael Shermack, our producer and network director, Jason Rackow. The Unfolding is a production of Faith Podcasts. We'll be back next week with another page of The Unfolding.